There we go. My name is Bet Hannon, and I'm the CEO of Accessicart. We are an agency that specializes in website accessibility and e-commerce, but really we focus on helping folks who have any kind of that sort of interaction on their site, like signups or payment forms, that sort of thing, like a lot of LMS sites where you have people signing up and checking out on your sites. I've been a WordPress user for a long time and run this agency remotely before remote was a thing. And you can find me on still on Twitter at Bet Hannon, and you can connect with me at our Accessicart website as well. So I want to start out a little bit by telling a little bit about our agency's accessibility story, how we got interested in accessibility. About 5 years ago, we had one of our existing clients, still a client of ours today, is a large California water district. They're actually a part of the state of California, and they let us know that they were aware that they had some new laws were coming up that required them to have certain levels of accessibility, and they asked them to help them with that. And we didn't know a lot about accessibility then, but all of us, the client and our team, dived in and we learned a lot about accessibility. And when our team learned about accessibility and how it can make a difference for people with disabilities as well as for site owners, we got hooked and passionate about making the web as widely accessible as possible. And I'm not the most technical person on our team. So what I'm going to talk about today are some practical tips, but not hugely technical issues about just how you can make your site more accessible and about what kinds of impact that can have. And a little bit, we'll talk today about some of the benefits of making your site accessible. So most people start getting interested in accessibility because they want to avoid a lawsuit. So you can see in this chart, it shows the number of website accessibility lawsuits in federal courts over the last 5 years. And as you can see, those are growing at a fairly significant rate. In the US, and I'm going to talk about our US context primarily because that's where we are, but the same would be true in other nations, UK, EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all have laws around accessibility requirements for accessibility. But in the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act offers legal protections for people with disabilities. And it's just, and the Department of Justice has said, yes, websites do come under Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's not quite clear how to meet those compliances, right? ADA was signed in 1990 before the internet was really so much of our daily life. And so what we're really left with are these lawsuits to help try to clarify what makes something compliant or not compliant. Those lawsuits are typically filed under what's called Title III of ADA, which deals with public accommodations. So Title II has to do with government. Title III is businesses and public accommodations. Now, it's important to know that this chart does not deal with, only deals with cases that go to court. So the first thing that might happen is that you might get what's called a demand letter, a letter that comes in the mail, old-fashioned postal mail letter that tells you somebody intends to sue you. It notifies you that there's some issue on your website and that if you don't take action, that you should be in touch with them because they intend to sue you. Now, these letters can look really like junk mail, and you might just toss them. In fact, one of our clients got one that really, when I looked up the attorney, he'd been disbarred 3 times. So, they can really look a little spammy like, but definitely don't throw them away. Don't ignore them. Do get your attorney involved and make a response. What will happen next if you ignore it is that you'll get a summons to go to court. So people that get those demand letters often settle out of court, and that is not reflected in these numbers. So lots more people are getting that initial piece, and they're doing some kind of a settlement before they even get there. Now, I don't really like to fuel the fear mongering. There are people who are terrified about these lawsuits, but I really think that there are a lot of more business positive, business building ways and reasons to make your website accessible. But if it's the fear of avoiding a lawsuit that motivates you, then, maybe that's what it takes. It is probably the biggest ROI for making your website accessible. There's some costs involved in making your website accessible potentially, but, you're probably going to pay at least $20,000 in fees and settlements if you get one of those letters. So, it is something that you want to pay attention to and get going. So when I go to networking events and I introduce myself and I say my agency specializes in website accessibility, a lot of times people are confused or at least curious because maybe they haven't ever even thought before about how disabled people might use the web. So let's first lay some groundwork by talking about what exactly website accessibility is. The big picture to know at the beginning is that there are a significant percentage of people that have a permanent or a temporary impairment that means they can't use the web in the same way as the majority of people. So a temporary impairment might be that I've broken my hand and I can't use a mouse. In the US, the CDC estimates that around 25% of all US adults, and it's about that percentage in almost all developed nations, 20 to 25%, that's 1 in 4 or 5 people. We're not talking about a tiny group of people here. We're really talking about quite a few people. And remember that this number goes up as we age, right? So if your demographic of people is an older demographic, you have even more reason for trying to make your website accessible. And remember that all of us are just one accident or illness away from some kind of disability. So we're talking about a significant number of people here. Really, what the definition of website accessibility is that it gives people with diverse abilities equal access and equal opportunity to access and use web content. Now, you might notice that this is really civil rights or human rights language. And that's the framework that we're thinking about when we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about website accessibility, that you're creating equal access, that you aren't excluding anyone. So what does website accessibility look like then on a practical level? Well, here's a couple of examples. If you're a person who has severe visual disabilities, maybe you're even totally blind, there are tools called screen readers that will read out loud to you the content on the website page. Not just the text content, but the code pieces behind that are specially formatted for screen readers, if it's all formatted properly. So one of the older screen reader technologies is JAWS, and a license for that might cost you $1,000 a year. It's not cheap to have disabilities. There's a newer screen reader, however, called NVDA for non-visual display access, and it's open source. That means it's free. You can go to the NVDA website and you can download that software, put it on your computer, and you can kind of test it out your website, see what it does for you. NVDA will ask you or offer you the opportunity to make a donation to their work, their open source work, and I encourage you to do that. They're doing some amazing work in developing countries, helping people, who are visually disabled to, have a life and careers. So encourage you to support that. It is important if you go to, you can go on YouTube and just search for, there are a number of demos of people who are visually impaired using screen readers, what it's like for them to use that. Just be aware that people who regularly use and depend on screen readers are going to use them differently than you might assume. So for instance, maybe you listen to your podcasts at 1.5 speed. People who depend on screen readers have their speed set on 4 and above. So it's fast. And we'll talk a little bit more about some things with screen readers. You should know that of these two products, JAWS is like the luxury car edition, and the NVDA is the clunky old Toyota Corolla that bounces along a little hard. So there's definitely a difference between them, but and there are some other tools like VoiceOver for Mac or iOS, so other kinds of screen readers that you can look at too. So if you're not able to use a mouse, here's another example. If you're not able to use a mouse with your hands, say you're paralyzed, like Stephen Hawking, There are adaptive devices. Stephen Hawking had a little sensor on his cheek that he would use with his cheek muscles. There are eye tracking devices. There are sip and puff devices. All of those devices come down to keyboard navigation. They're essentially clicking the tab and enter key on the keyboard for the person to navigate through the website. But that's another way that people are using the website when they have those types of disabilities. And of course, there are a lot of other kinds of disabilities that are out there, not just people who are blind, but people who have low vision who may need kind of magnification options, people who are colorblind. There are age-related vision changes, not just like as I'm beginning to experience more trouble with small print, right? Those kinds of things. But as we age, the lens of our eye yellows, and so it changes color perception. That's why people sometimes have trouble with color contrast as they age. There are increasing mobility issues, not just can't use a mouse, but people who may have a palsy or a shake and can't hit your tiny little button on their phone. Reading disabilities, seizures. If you have flashing things or things that change, seizures can be induced if you're not careful. People with cognitive disabilities, for instance, may not be able to solve a math CAPTCHA. There are people with sensory or focus issues. So we have someone on our team who, they get really car sick, but if you have a video on your site with a lot of motion in it, it can induce the nausea, being car sick just watching your website, things like ADHD. And even we begin to look at things like anxiety and depression. So people who have, for example, anxiety have a very low threshold for sticking with a long checkout process. And if you're not giving feedback about, where they are in the process, they may just give up and leave before they're ready. So all kinds of disabilities, and there's no limit on the on the disabilities. And so as you, if you stop to think about it, then you get things that are what we call comorbid, like coexisting disabilities, right? So there's really no way any website is 100% accessible, but we're trying to be accessible to the biggest number of people, right? The as much as we can begin to think about that. So the place you would want to go if you want to begin to look at what are the specific kind of technical guidelines for things. Now, these are not rules, and they're not, and there are a lot of times where, depending on what you're trying to do, the context, you may get conflicting guidelines, right? So, but the guidelines are called the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. Or the WCAG, sometimes people will say. You can find those at, there's a checklist for them. Now, there are 3 levels of that, A, AA, AAA. Most often, people are going for AA standards. That's the most common focus of effort. And so that would be where you would start learning more about implementations of web accessibility. But let's start talking about some tips for LMS sites and what you might want to do. These are some practical tips for beginning to think about how to make your website accessible. So as I mentioned before, most accessibility devices for people who have mobility impairments and screen reader users are dependent on keyboard navigation. You may have done like a Control X or a Control S, right, for saving or cutting things. And there are thousands of keyboard shortcuts that you can use. If you've ever like pressed the Tab key to work your way through a form, all kinds of ways that you can do those shortcuts. There are people who are dependent on those working. And so if you just go to your website, just refresh your website, and then only try to start navigating through your website by clicking the Tab and Enter keys. See how far you can get and how easy it is to do. Can people find things on your site? Is it frustrating? Is there often there's the first thing that should come up is what's called skip to content in the upper, usually in the upper left-hand corner, might be in the middle, and that allows the user to skip over your menu, which might take a lot of tabbing to get through, right? And be, as you might imagine, frustrating to keep tabbing through every time they change the page. So start testing out your site. One of the most important things that you can do is to use proper semantic markup. And that means using your H tags properly. Now, a lot of times people think only about the H tags in terms of styling the content, making the fonts different sizes. But really, those H tags are supposed to be indicating the level of the content. So in WordPress, the H1 is always the page or post or lesson title. And then after that, you start, it's almost like our high school essay outlines, right? You know, remember using Roman numerals, and then you indent a little bit more, and you use the capital letters, you indent a little bit more, right? That's how the H tags are supposed to work. So you want to properly nest them. And that means you never ever skip from an H2 to an H4 or 5, right? You never omit a level. You always want to have a level under that. And this is important. And by the way, the size of the font for your H tags can be anything. The size of the font. Now, normally you're going to want to make, start with the H1 being the biggest and kind of move down. But you could change that. The size of the font doesn't matter. But what you're doing is you're giving those screen reader users and those keyboard accessible people options to skip through your content, because they know that they can press a certain combination of keys and just get the main highlights, right? And so you want to make sure those are all nested on your site. And quite frankly, they're doing some of the same things that we're doing, right? When we're reading, we're just scanning through the highlights sometimes too, right? Visual people are. So properly using your semantic markup. The next one is to make sure you're using alt text on your images. So when you add an image to your content, it needs to have alt text. Now, that's not the same thing as a caption. You might also have a caption, but the purpose of the alt text is to describe the image for the benefit of users who cannot see it. But that's also the text that will appear for somebody that has a low band internet connection, right? If their internet connection is so low it can't load the images, or for some reason the images aren't appearing, that's what they'll see. So anytime you're showing an image that has text on it, and you really should avoid doing that as much as possible, but you might make in Canva an image that has some text on it. You want to make sure that that text is also appearing in either on the surface of the page or as part of the alt text. And I've given a little example here. A description of an image might be a woman with 2 children playing in the sand on the beach. So it's giving you some real clear sense of that. But your alt text might be different for the same image depending on how you're using it in your context. And there are entire webinar presentations out there about how to write good alt text, including, excuse me, some from members of our team, Meg Miller. So you might want to just Google around for those recordings, learn more about alt text. Number 3 is color contrast. So the accessibility guidelines give you some measurements for defining the color contrast between the color of a font and the text, the color in the background, right, against it. And there's a way that gets measured, and we don't even need to understand even how that all happens, but it gets measured. And as you can see from this graphic, there are some combinations of colors that are really hard to read and others that are easier to read. And those good and bad labels there might give you some indication, right? There are automated tools that will help you check the color contrast. One of them is, the link for one of them is right there below, color contrast checker. You just Google color contrast checker. And typically you're just putting in the little 6-digit hex code for the color of the font and the color of the background, and it will tell you whether that color combination meets the guidelines or not. Now, those guidelines change depending on how big the font gets. Right? So if it's a larger font, you can have less contrast. But if it's a smaller font, then you have higher standards for the contrast, right? So you'll want to check those out with color contrast checker. These 3 things that I've already mentioned, right? The H tags, the alt text, the color contrast, These three items account for about 80% of all web accessibility issues. Now, you can notice that they're not all that hard or technical for people to solve, right? The keyboard navigation may require your developer to make changes to your theme, but by and large, they're fairly easy to kind of begin to get a handle on. So when you start, I would focus on those three first. But then there are some other things, and especially some things for LMS system sites that you'll want to pay attention to. Kind of related to color contrast is avoiding color coding. So when you're putting together your content, you want to make sure you're not using color coding as the only method of an indication. So about 10% of people are colorblind, and red-green colorblind is one of the most common types of colorblindness. This is the type that my brother has. So one easy way to do this is to use some symbols or patterns as well as color. So you can see in the indication on the left that they're only using the green and red boxes, where on the right there's a symbol that's the particular color, right? So you can still use the color, but just make sure that's not the only indication. So you're helping people who are colorblind make sure they're easily getting understanding what you're trying to convey. So the guidelines, there are some guidelines around using descriptive link text. So when you make a link in WordPress, usually you highlight a bit of text, and then you click the link icon, and that bit of text that you've highlighted is what appears on the surface of the page, and that's called the link text. So when you're making links, you want to be aware of a couple of different disability user profile disabilities. So one of them, just building on this color blindness. So you want to make sure that your links are indicated by something other than just color. So you want to, typically we would make a link, changed, it might be a changed color, but it also might have an underline or a dash line, or it might be bold. But you want to make sure there's a different indication other than just color for your links. But additionally, people who are dependent on screen readers, and by the way, that's not just people who are visually impaired. Some people with cognitive disabilities also depend on screen readers. People who use screen readers often skip through the content and have the screen reader read aloud just some of the H tags or just link text. And if you think about it, that's often what we're doing too, right? Sighted users are doing too, right? We're scanning through the text to look for things that might be significant or meaningful for us. So it's really important that all of the text that you put into a link could stand on its own outside the context of the text around it, right? So if someone were going to read aloud just to the link text, they would know exactly where that link was going to take them and what it was going to do. So for example, click here is not helpful, right? Because it doesn't tell the user anything about where they're going to go or what's going to happen. But if you had the link read, click here to read the report on campus crime, that user would know exactly where they were going to go and what was going to happen. So using descriptive link text. So sometimes people are in the habit of using a hyphen or a closing bracket to create what visually might look like a list, a bulleted list, right? Sometimes we might also create the appearance of a column by simply tabbing over instead of actually creating a column. Now that's a problem because when you use the embedded tools, like in this image I'm showing on the screen, there's the little bullet points or the numbered lists, right? Those add special code to help the screen reader identify, for a person that can't see it, that that's a list. And it gives them additional context for understanding your content. So you always want to use actual bulleted or numbered lists, actual columns, actual tables when they're a part of your website or documents, so that the screen readers users will have that context for understanding what this content is. LMS sites often include PDFs and other documents, and so it's important for you to know that those other documents must also conform to all the guidelines that we've been talking about and describing that are needed for web pages. So you'll want to use the same semantic markup If you're dealing with color, you'll need to deal with color and color contrast, avoid color coding, alt text, descriptive links, all of those things. For longer documents, you'll want to use a table of contents. And this is true for web pages too. If you have a very long web page, you'll want to use a table of contents block at the top as well. That helps people navigate through the site, through the page. In documents, but also in web pages, you'll need to take special care with tables and charts. And if you Google around, you can find some webinars and tutorials on accessibility for tables and charts. They can become quite complicated, and you'll want to avoid doing things like conjoining two cells. That can be really difficult. So you can find a lot more information out there. But also be aware that editing tools like Adobe and Microsoft Word and other tools already have inside of them some accessibility tools and checkers that you can make use of. So that can be a great help for making sure that your documents are accessible in your LMS. If you share multimedia files like audio and video files as a part of your lessons in LMS, you need to make sure that these are accessible. The files need to have some accommodations in or alongside of them. So audio files must have a written transcript, and sometimes this is placed all on the same page where the audio player is. Like, so you might have the audio player, and then below it, just right, all printed out, the transcript. But it's fine to link if the transcript is on a separate page and the user can link off to it, as long as it's available, right? And videos should either use captions inside the video or transcripts alongside, or both, because some prefer, right? Do be aware that research is showing that people who use videos on social media with the captions turned on, so presumably their sound is off, 80% of them are not hearing impaired. So they may be in a situation like a public setting where they simply prefer to watch the video with the sound off. This is one example of how making your content accessible for people with disabilities improves the user experience for non-disabled users as well. This is like, we were talking a little bit in the pre-show about curb cuts for strollers or ramps for people who use strollers, right? And becoming more aware of, those curb cuts are there to help people with disabilities, but they also make life easier for people who are using strollers or wheeled luggage or those kinds of things. So there are a number of free and low-cost tools that will help you automatically generate captions and transcripts for your audio and video files, including YouTube and Zoom. They can help you do those. And most of these tools give you not all, but most of them give you the option to edit the captions and the transcripts. And you really, really do want to make sure you read through and edit these, because sometimes the automatically generated captions are hilariously wrong, and sometimes they are embarrassingly wrong. And captions and transcripts with a high degree of errors can also be really offensive to people with disabilities. So you really do want to take advantage of making some edits and correcting, especially if it's anything technical, right? The automated captions may not get your insider language. We find this a lot when we're talking about, WordPress and plugins and, PHP or whatever, So, and finally, another one of my final tips for LMS sites, which is the same for other kinds of e-commerce and membership sites, is that you want to be aware that checkouts and sign-up processes are a common place to find accessibility issues. Now, sometimes the base plugin that you're using, like WooCommerce, is fairly accessible out of the box. LearnDash is not quite, but is getting there, working on that, right? They can be fairly accessible out of the box. But when you start adding additional plugins, anything that affects front-end display, you may be introducing accessibility issues. And so you really do want to take the time to check on that. Because, if the blind person can't figure out how to put in their credit card number, you've lost that sale, right? So you want to make sure you're doing that. Primarily, you're looking for keyboard navigation and the ability to make changes to particular fields as a part of the checkout process. So making sure your checkout or sign-up process is working for people. Here's a PSA. So there are some some of the free tools that I've been recommending to you to check on your accessibility use artificial intelligence to check for accessibility issues. And there are some plugins, particularly the ones that are flush with capital venture investments, who seem to be everywhere advertising that they will fix all of your accessibility issues by installing their plugin or their little bit of code, their little script. And those plugins come down to they're scripts that look for accessibility issues and fix at least some of them on the fly. And they often provide what's called a little widget, you can see a little, often a little disability icon in the lower corner of the site with some tools for improving accessibility for certain disabilities. These are called overlay plugins more broadly. It's important to know that those artificial intelligence tools, including the checkers, can only find about 30% of accessibility issues. So for instance, that tool can tell you whether you have alt text, but not whether it's good alt text. It might be the, JPEG 39492. That's not really good alt text. It can't tell you whether any of your pages are keyboard navigable, which is a huge accessibility issue. And it's really not advised to use these plugins, but if you do use them, you just be aware they're not going to solve all your accessibility issues. It would be nice to have an easy button, but there's not really, that doesn't exist. And you'll still need to do some work around accessibility. Additionally, these plugins and services are using JavaScript to put those little widget tools on the page. And the disabled user almost always, if they need a magnifier or they need some other kind of tool, they have it already installed for the other 99% of websites that are out there. And so often what happens is that these two tools now conflict and neither of them work. So most disabled people are now installing browser extensions to block those overlay plugins because they prefer their own tools that are customized and they know how to use rather than your tool that's, they don't know, right? There are also some increasing concerns about privacy with these tools because it appears that the two services are storing, when a person says, yeah, I need magnification, now they've given protected health information that they didn't maybe opt into, and it appears that these services are storing that information connected to their IP address in ways that violate privacy laws without notifying the site owner or the user, and no way to remove that. So some privacy concerns. And finally, we're also seeing some increasing anecdotal evidence that sites using these overlay plugins are being targeted for lawsuits because it's a simple step to prove that the site owner knew they should be doing something about accessibility because you installed that plugin, but that you didn't fix all the issues. So you may want to think twice about using these overlays. The best place to get information about what the overlay plugins are, how they work, is overlayfactsheet.com and some other sites there with some resources. Speaking of resources, here's one. Your business may qualify for up to a 50% non-refundable tax credit. So no, you don't get to a tax deduction, but you get a reduction in the amount of other taxes you owe when you do pretty much anything to make your website more accessible. You have to have under 30 employees or under $1 million in gross revenue. So one or the other, but not necessarily both. And it can include redesigning your website for accessibility, the whole project, getting an audit, having remediations done, all of those things. And that little screenshot that you see in the laptop there, that's the whole form, right? You can, there's a $250 minimum, but you can get up to claim an expense up to $10,000. And so it's a great way, and you can claim it repeatedly. So great way to get some help in trying to make your website more accessible. So real quickly, let's just talk about some benefits of accessibility. We said people with disabilities are 25% of the U.S. population. You can increase your potential audience. When you're adding alt text and H tags in the proper ways, you're improving your SEO. So it's a win-win all around. We've already talked about you're improving everybody's experience when you do this. It's usually a lot cheaper to keep your current customers and users and learners than to acquire new ones. And so, the likelihood of developing disabilities increases as we age. So it's a great investment in your current customers, keeping people, if that's part of your business model. And a lot of people really like to feel good about the brands that they purchase from. And so it can be a great investment in your brand to be more inclusive, put that out there. One of the ways that you do that is typically by creating an accessibility policy on your website. It doesn't have to be super front and center. Ours is in the footer of our website. This is a screenshot from our site. Typically, your accessibility policy includes some statement like, we want everybody to be able to use this website. Two, we have some commitment to WCAG, or at least an acknowledgement that you're making the site, you're trying to make the site accessible for people with disabilities. And then some acknowledgement that, accessibility is an ongoing thing. It's not a once and done. That people may encounter problems, invite them to email you about it, and then of course taking things seriously. So another resource that you might want to think about at some point, or just know that it exists, is an accessibility audit. And this is where you get some in-depth testing done around your site to find and identify accessibility issues. You want to be aware of companies that are offering you just a cheap or free audit. It should cost you maybe several $1,000s to get a qualified one. The cheaper free ones are probably using some kind of AI just generated thing that you could do yourself. You want to make sure you get some human testing, but it doesn't have to be disabled people that are testing your site. Good accessibility trained developers will know what to look for when they're doing human testing. Typically, if you look for what's called a sampling audit, so maybe as few as 10 URLs of your page, that are representative of your content. So your checkout pages, but a lesson, maybe your overview pages, some of your different layouts. Then you can extrapolate from that. That's typically way more affordable to do than everything on your site. And then usually you can find a company like ours, and there are other folks out there that do this for sites, but you could have a company like ours do the audit and then bring your developer, if you have one, alongside to have your own developer do the remediations if needed for that. So finally, accessibility is the right thing to do, but it does make business sense. And I appreciate your time today, wanting to learn a little bit more about accessibility. And again, my name is Beth Hannon, and I'm at Beth Hannon, and accessagart.com is our website. And